Imagine you are standing on a wind-caressed hill, overlooking a copse of woods, which is on the banks of the Minnesota River near Lac qui Parle in western Minnesota. It is a spring day. The birds are chirping, the breeze is light, and the sky is blue. This peaceful setting could have been any time before 1870. As you gaze down the woods over the tall prairie grass, your eyes are drawn to two tracks through that tall prairie grass. Odd, you muse. A trail way out here. I wonder what... Suddenly, the peace and quiet is disturbed. A sound growing louder to a point where your ears actually begin to hurt from a mixture of harsh, screeching, squeaking sounds. Cacophony which could be emanating from a dozen giant and poorly tuned violins. What can be the source of this madness? Then, movement down by the river. Barely visible at first, but something is emerging out of the woods. Two oxen heads appear, and you can see that they are linked to a cart, a large two-wheeled cart. The wheels are as tall as a person, and those carts, as it moves forward, you see, contain furs. Then more carts move out of the woods until a brigade line of two-wheeled carts slowly marches towards your perch on the hill. Each cart is pulled by a large animal, an oxen, and every third cart has a MAGE guide leading it. This podcast will provide an overview about the travels of the Red River Valley carts, which brought furs from the northern trapping areas of Minnesota and Canada to the destinations in Minnesota, especially the Port of St. Paul. At the end of this podcast, there will be opportunities to listen to more podcasts and sites where you can find out more information about the Red River cart trails. Also, 2 downloadable attachments may be found which will guide your listening and map skills. The Red River Cart Trail is a product of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. MAGE is a nonprofit organization of volunteers, teachers, and others who seek to improve the quality of geographic learning and teaching at every level. Today, Dr. David Landergan, Director of MAGE and Professor of Geography at Macalester College in St. Paul, will explain what the Red River Trail was all about, how it got started, why there were more than one trail, and how long it lasted.
We're standing here on one of the remnants of the Red River Oxcart trails. This one is a southern trail, and it's coming up from the banks of the Minnesota River. Minnesota River lies beyond that row of trees at the edge of the grassland there. And the trail, as you can see, wanted to come up in a gradual way up to the upland here. So it kind of wound its way along the base of the hill and then gradually moved toward the top and up on the highlands and on towards St. Paul. The trail started up in Pembina with a long established connections to the rest of the world. Pembina may seem like a long way away from Europe, but it was the center of the fur trade, and the population that lived there provided food for the fur traders that would travel north into the Athabasca region beyond the range of agriculture. And the Métis, the people who worked the trail, hunted buffalo and other game as well, and dried it and mixed it with berries to make pemmican, which was used as the basic food in the fur trade business. But the trail came down into the Red River Valley and then the Minnesota Valley, and then followed the Minnesota Valley towards St. Paul. Not much remains of it, but there is this little fragment here, and you can see how the trail wore its way down through the level, so to speak, the surface, and in sort of I won't really call it a ditch, but certainly a depression that was worn by the carts as they wound their way up the hill onto the upland.
And why were there 3 different trails up to Pembina?
Well, the Métis were descendants of both the Ojibwe, Cree, and French traders. The Dakota ruled the territory down here, and from time to time the the Dakota would take exception to the Métis traveling through their territory. So when hostilities were hot, the trail moved north through the woods, which was not as desirable because there wasn't as much grazing along the trail for the ox. So there were three trails, sort of a woods one that was the least easy, but the safest, and then one in the middle, and then the southern one down here, which was preferred because there were, of course, fur traders along the Minnesota River that could deal with the caravan as it passed through.
And when was this trail quite active? When would you see ox carts out on the trail? What time?
Well, that would be in the 1830s. I don't know exactly when the trade ended, but it was certainly ended, by the railroad, which ran west and displaced it. So the trail was the sort of first connection between the Red River Valley and the Twin Cities, and it would, of course, be replaced by both trains and highways later.
And the ruts in the ground we're looking at then are about 180 years old. They have still evidence.
I would guess so. Yep. I don't know exactly why they were preserved here. Most places the trail was plowed under, but so for some reason this hillside remained unplowed and gently used, so to speak, and the trail has been preserved.
One of the reasons that this trail in this area has been preserved is the efforts of Lynn Locken and her family. Years ago, Lynn started a nonprofit organization called the Lac qui Parle Prairie Preservation, and the people who joined her in that effort are to be commended, so that we can stand here and use our imaginations to watch the ox carts go by. It must have been quite a sight. Maybe you could give us a little bit of a description of how you think that might have looked.
About 10 of these carts squeaking and wailing, and of course there'd be people walking alongside, talking to the oxen and talking to each other. Or even a train, which may have up to 100 of these carts walking along in their fairly leisurely pace of about 2 miles an hour. They might have made 25 miles a day. Of course, the days were long. But the oxen couldn't walk constantly. They had to be rested and fed, and they had to stay close to water so the oxen could be adequately watered each day. And, of course, the people would camp out. So I can't say it was like a party, but it wasn't a fast-paced march across the prairies. The cattle, of course, were descendants of cattle brought across the Atlantic by the French, so they were smaller than the kind of oxen you see pictures of. Nowadays we have these really big oxen that are descended from the dairy breeds, but the oxen that this population used were smaller animals. And while they were strong, they were limited in what they could carry. So the carts were not huge. If you think of the Conestoga wagon of the Oregon Trail with several teams of oxen or horses pulling them, this was not like that at all. These were smaller carts pulled by a single oxen. Occasionally there might be two hitched to the oxen. The ox carts were made of all natural products, and so they, if something broke, local wood or hide could be used to fix the wagons. They didn't have to have a forge along with them to make new iron parts. The ox cart trade flourished as long as the fur trade was profitable. The trails, as you can see from the map, went through 3 different environments. And unfortunately, there was a geopolitical aspect to these trails as well. When the hostility between the Dakota and Ojibwe was high, the trail moved northward to avoid the Sioux lands or the Dakota lands along the Minnesota. That was unfortunate because in the northern route there weren't as many trading posts for the ox cart trailers to stop at and refresh themselves and pick up supplies and so on. So there's a kind of a geopolitical part of the trail as well as the environmental part of the trail. In the territorial times when the trail was flourishing, there really were no roads. But gradually, once the state, not the state, but the territory was formulated, the federal government began to build what were so-called territorial roads or defensive roads. They generally went to the same direction that the oxcart trails went. Some of these new roads went right over the oxcart route. Some of them were different. So the oxcart trail faded away for two reasons. One, the end of the fur trade and hide trade, and the other reason, the more improved transportation system, first territorial roads, and then the coming of the railroad. And of course the railroad could carry vastly larger quantities of product, and that just displaced totally the Red River Oxcart Trail, and the trade between the Red River Valley and St. Paul continued. It followed different forms of technology. This trade was extremely important because it was the first major export from Minnesota, and it enabled a cash flow to be concentrated in what's now St. Paul, and enabled the merchants there to sell goods to the Métis, who then took all that material back up to Pembina and the Red River. And the hides and furs were valuable, so even though these ox carts looked simple, they were carrying very valuable commodities. Although this was a relatively short period in Minnesota's history, interesting time, an unusual time, but an extremely important time in the history of the state.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. MAGE would like to thank Mr. Max Hind of Montevideo for his generous tour of the area and his many insightful comments during that tour. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. I'm Fred Kunze, a member of the MAGE Steering Committee.